Christians be involved in politics? The answers to that question can be fast and furious. I mean, there's a spectrum of beliefs out there in regards to our political engagement. From the side who believe we should never be engaged because that's a worldly thing to do, to those who are advocating for a Christian nation. But how shall we navigate these very chaotic waters in which we find ourselves? You know, over the past few months, we at Apollos Watered have had many different discussions in regards to politics and our involvement in it. And of course, we know that this entire process is fraught with confusion, which is why we have our special guest today, Vincent Bacote. Dr. Vincent Bacote is a professor of theology and the director of the Center for Applied Christian Ethics at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. He's the author of Reckoning with Race and Performing the Good News in Search of a Better Evangelical Theology, The Political Disciple, A Theology of Public Life, The Spirit in Public Theology, Appropriating the Legacy of Abraham Kuyper, and has contributed to books including On Kuyper, Aliens in the Promised Land, Keep Your Head Up, and Prophetic Evangelicals. He's a regular columnist for Comment Magazine and contributes to other magazines, including Books and Culture, Christianity Today, Think Christian, and Regeneration Quarterly, and journals such as Christian Scholars Review and several others, Urban Mission and the Journal for Christian Theological Research. He's a member of the Evangelical Theological Society and Society for Christian Ethics. He resides in the Chicago area, my old stomping grounds, and with his family. And today, he's a guest on Apollos Watered. Dr. Vincent Bacote, welcome to Apollos Watered.
Hey, it is great to be here. I'm excited for the conversation.
Oh, I love that. Let's get after it then. But before we do, are you ready for the Fast Five?
Let's bring it.
Okay, here we go. The best motivational movie for you all time is what?
Motivational?
Yeah, it gets you going. Like, that's a great movie. It inspires you.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's hard. You know what? I'm gonna go with Shawshank Redemption. Because the way it ends, it's about friendship and stuff like that. Going through a lot of difficulty, and then at the end you have this great reconciliation, and you also have certain transformations that people go through.
That's one I wouldn't have considered, but
I mean, there's like Star Wars, well, which Star Wars, but Rocky and other things like that. But to me, it's like, okay, what's going to make me want to go, be a better person in certain ways.
Shawshank Redemption.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Next one then.
I guess that's not what most people have said.
Well, I've never done that question before. So you're the first person. You laid the baseline for that one. Okay. But I was curious. I had Rocky in my head just because I always have Eye of the Tiger. I can't.
Oh yeah, sure.
It's just maybe I try to introduce it to my kids, and even as I'm watching it in bed with them, like we're laying all out of the bed and we're watching it, and I feel like I got to get up and start doing push-ups. Oh, and I'm like, I'm not going to do that. Yeah. I'm tired. I'm winded walking to the.
Well, when I saw Enter the Dragon with Bruce Lee, that would have been a film that did that as well in the 70s.
We need to have a motivational movie though for guys that are like over 40, maybe even over 50. What's that motivational movie? That's going to be.
I think Shawshank. I mean,
that's true. It took him how many years to dig the hole? What? 26?
Yeah, I mean, it took a lot. Yeah. Well, and also though, Andy Dufresne changes. Because when he sits in the yard and tells Red that he did kill his wife, and knows he killed his wife by being, he came to himself. He had like a recognition of what kind of person he had been that drove her into the arms of somebody else.
I never even thought about it that way. I forgot he actually said that in the movie.
Yeah,
it's been a while. All right, we have to get to the next question. Here we go. Second question. You're at the international section of your grocery store. What's the one item you're definitely going to get?
Oh, wow. Well, because I've just came back from the Netherlands recently, I'll say stroopwafels.
What is that?
Yeah, these circular waffles they're filled with syrup, and they're pressed together. You put them on top of your coffee when it's warm, and it makes them soft and chewy.
I have never had it. What is it?
People call them stroop waffles in America, but you say stroopwafel in if you're in the Netherlands.
So, you have
STROOPWAFEL.
There's so many people that are listening to the show right now where they're writing that down.
Yeah, check it out, folks. Check it out.
Okay, here we go. Next question, number 3. Who is the one author that you wish you could get everyone to read, and why?
I'm going to go with uh, certain selections from Kuyper is what I'll say.
I wondered what the pause was, because you've written all about Kuyper. I'm
Yeah, I
surprised
know,
you didn't jump all over
you know,
Kuyper.
but Kuyper stands on the shoulders of other people. They're contemporary authors who've done very helpful things for people. Um, you know, there are lots of good books out there. And then there are people whose voices you want more people to hear their voices. So that's part of what's going on inside my head.
We're going to come back to Abraham Kuyper in a bit for those who don't
Yeah,
know who he is. So
yeah,
we'll put a pause on that one. But
yeah.
here's the next question. Number 4. If you were a section at IKEA, what section would you be and why?
Well, it's been a long time since I've been at IKEA, so that's is it like where there's cabinets? Is it like where there's, you know, is it the restaurant? Is it the, you know, I'm going to go with the restaurant because the restaurant is, you know, it's a different experience for people,
It
right?
is.
Because you've got, I mean, I'm not saying the restaurant because I have any kind of Scandinavian heritage, which I do not. There's French. No, actually, you know what? There was like a 0.1% Scandinavian thing in my 23 and me, I think
23 and you.
actually.
Okay.
But
1%. 1%.
yeah, but there's more like, you know, UK, some French, that kind of stuff. But let's go with the restaurant because it has a uniqueness to it.
It does. Swedish meatballs. I mean, come
Yeah,
on.
yeah,
And the
yeah,
Lingonberry stuff. Oh,
yeah,
that's good stuff.
yeah.
I
So
like
let's
this.
go with the restaurant, and also because um, I there's a variety of things that I like. I'm
Hmm.
I like if you go to my office, there's different kind. You never know what music you're going to hear. You can hear metal, you can hear classical, you can hear electronica, you can hear R&B. You know,
You're very eclectic in your
yeah,
musical
yeah,
tastes.
yeah. You could definitely hear jazz fusion. Yeah.
All right. Well, then let's get to the final question of the Fast Five is this one. Because we are going to be talking about what it means to be a political disciple today,
Yeah.
if you were running for office, what would your campaign slogan be and why?
Um, the campaign slogan would be something like casting a vision for a better life together.
Oh, that you've thought about this.
I mean, that's kind of what it would be because it's also what I wish at this moment. You know, so we're recording this in April of 2024. It's not yet November of 2024, and of course, we have two presumptive candidates. I do believe in miracles. And if a miracle candidate were to emerge, it would be somebody who I would want to be doing that kind of thing.
Mm, mm.
Somebody who's under 65, who is able to talk to all kinds of people, and who can cast a vision where people can see that we're trying to pull together to move forward rather than that we need to see who to blame about getting in our way to having the life that we hope we can have together or even just our own flourishing.
Well, there are miracles, and
Yeah,
I'm hopeful for that. I'm going to pray
yeah,
that way, but I'm not sure if that's going to happen. I think we
yeah,
get
yeah.
through those things.
It's asking for a big one.
It is. But we'll see. Stranger things have happened. I
Yeah,
mean, you never know what's going to happen. Who knows? I mean, when you
yeah.
have the candidates as old as they are, anything can happen. I, I mean, just biology. But let's talk about your book. Now, this book was written in what, 20, it says 2015 or
Yeah,
2016, I think.
2015.
I wanted to talk about the book. It's called The Political Disciple, Theology of Public Life. It's not a very long book, but it's a great introduction book because I think you have helped people start where they are, where most people have started that are Christians in their understanding of politics, and you help move to a greater understanding of politics. And I don't want to give too much away. But let's start with talking about the book and a little of your story, because in some respect, this book is autobiographical in your understanding of politics and how you grew. But where did you start off when you came to Jesus? How did you understand political engagement?
Well, growing up Baptist, I became a Christian. I may have become a Christian when I was 9 or 10, but I didn't get baptized. And I joined the church to get baptized. I was probably like 11. Um, but so then it was just what are you hearing from your relatives? And so I'm born in 1965. So that's when you begin to get the shift from African Americans supporting Republicans to supporting the Democratic Party. So I grew up in a house where you just assume that the Democrats who you vote for. And of course, you know, in a way, like a single issue voter thing, the single issue being that composite of issues related to the flourishing of African Americans, or really just African Americans being able to participate uh, fully and without duress in the United States of America. Um, and the idea that that Democratic politicians were in support of this. Of course, it's way more complicated than that. One recognizes now, but that's who at least was giving lip service to it. So, but it develops in college, where one I'm very thankful for the campus ministry I was involved in, made some great friends. And then the 1984 election rolls around, and people are talking about voting for Republicans, and I'm wondering what universe I'm in. And so then I didn't say anything about what I thought about politics. And so what was going on really at the time was uh, vote, yeah, but how much should Christians be involved? And particularly, I mean, the bigger crisis for me was how should Christians be involved in the culture per se, of which politics is a dimension. And what I was beginning to pick up was um, you should be arm's length at best when it comes to the culture because of the potential of worldliness corrupting you. And certainly, the more that I grew in my discipleship and my desire to have a life committed to God, I mean, there were some major transformations that happened in college in that regard. It wasn't that I showed up in terms of like being a person that was, you know, running away from God. I wasn't at all. It just turned some big illuminations that happened that were steps of maturation that happened. And so my roots were going deeper. And while they were going deeper, and I had this desire to live this life to be completely pleasing to God, well, what did that mean when you're the guy in the Bible study who's listening to Iron Maiden? Well, I mean, it meant that people thought that you were like the person that was in danger of being too worldly. And
Mhm.
so the conversations around that created this sense where, on the one hand, I had an intuition that Christians could participate in all of public life, politics, culture, etc. But there was like, no, don't get too involved.
Hmm.
And so I had an intuition that that wasn't quite right. But it wasn't until really I was in seminary and reading Kuyper where I got the theological lenses, the theological conceptuality and language to articulate why it was possible for Christians to, and proper for Christians to be publicly engaged. And of course, open parenthesis, I mean, something I was taking for granted then was assuming you're in a place where you can be involved in politics, where you can be culturally formative. Because Christians, not everywhere in the world is that true of Christians.
The church that you grew up in, and you said it, I'm curious of your journey because you said, okay, I came to Christ, I was baptized. The people around me were, of course, African American, saying this is how we vote. This is the culture, all these different pieces. But when you get off into college, is that where the cultural engagement was different? Because traditionally, and forgive me if I'm thinking this differently, just because I've seen other churches, especially coming from more ethnic backgrounds, are usually much more engaged in the political process, especially from African American backgrounds than
I
I've
would
seen white
say,
churches.
I no, I think what happened is, I mean, that even in your African American churches, even though there is a certain sense of, hey, survival requires us to, hey, people
Be
should vote.
engaged. Yeah.
But some churches are definitely more
There's a
upfront
spectrum.
about people need to do that. Yeah. Our church was not one that said don't be too worldly, but there was also not a lot of conversation in terms of what we were talking about in church about public life things. It was about knowing God really,
Mm.
and being so. But so there were no warnings really. Um, but I think if I were in more of a holiness tradition church, black or white, I think there would have been that kind of warning. And I think in the larger evangelical movement, which I came into in college, you had definitely that spectrum there.
Mm.
And also you had definitely the suspicion about, social gospel, suspicion about worldliness, um, about the culture being corrosive and potentially dangerous for young people, all those types of things. And the wake of the sexual revolution, all that type of stuff. And so I think there was um, the sense of that the world out there is mostly dangerous in a way, and and that people should be leery of thinking about having too much involvement in it, because then your priorities might get out of order.
Let's talk about then the difference between the world and creation.
Yeah,
You give
yeah,
a
yeah.
you talk about that in the early part of your book
Yes,
because that sets up
yes,
the thesis.
yes.
Why is it important to keep those two words at the forefront?
Because I think a lot of people, when they think about the world, they think about the created order, the creation, but it's not clear about sort of the range of meanings, right? Or how the terms are used in context. And if you just simply collapse the creation itself onto world in the way that world gets used as something to be nervous about, then you associate too much care about the created order with worldliness. And a way that I think is really important to help people to see the difference is in 1 John 2:15-17, because it's one of the main texts. If somebody's going to say, "Don't be worldly," okay, do not love the world. 1 John 2:15 says, right? But then the world is described, and the created order is not described, right? Lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, pride of life. That's described. Those are dispositions, loyalties, commitments, misdirected desires, ways of operating in the creation as if the creation is all there is, or as if something else that's created is giving you your marching orders, rather than living in the created order in accordance with the one that made the created order. So worldliness is not to be this identified as the same as creation. Worldliness is about a way that one participates in the creation with an allegiance to someone or something other than the one who made the creation. And so
Mm.
that's what the world is. And also there's this way of talking about the world that means world system, which means a way of going about life that is set up again in opposition to the way that God says to participate in his created order. And that's the world. So I think it's important for people to understand that. Can you say are creation and world synonyms in the Bible? Sometimes. When the Bible says worldly, does it mean by definition creaturely, or does it mean of the creation? Not necessarily. Usually,
Mm.
when it means worldly, it has something to do with a way of living in the world as a human, where you're doing something that's dissonant with the way that God wants humans to live. And so, really, I think worldliness is about an improper allegiance in function and operating in God's world. It's operating in God's world. Say, hey, thanks for like giving us this opportunity to participate in your world. Now we'll find something here to give us our marching orders. It's like it's like when you read about idolatry in Isaiah. All the times it keeps talking about people, chopping down a tree, and some of it you use for wood, and some of it you craft into an idol, and then you bow to the work of your hands. Kind of a strange thing, right? But that's what people do all the time. So worldliness is really that kind of, you know, living life in God's world, God's creation, with a commitment to some other competing God. Whether that God is the self or that God is something out in the world itself.
Is then worldliness a form of idolatry?
Uh, I think it's fair to say that, because it's about allegiance to something else. I think a lot of times people might say, well, I mean, I don't really think that's by idolatry, which I would want to say is, look, at some point, it's idolatry in the sense of, even if it seems like it's a less intense version of it, uh, it's living your life with a set of commitments that are not God's commitments.
Mm.
And whatever choices you're making about whatever it is, about how I choose to talk to my spouse or my children, or or from my boss, how I talk to employees, or how I talk to coworkers, or how I talk to the people in the grocery store, or if I'm a manager, how I think about management, if I think about the kind of culture I want in a place, how am I crafting what that is? What's giving me the values I have for that? Where those values coming from? Those values are If those values aren't coming from God, if they're coming from some way that says that your most important thing really points to an ultimate value that comes from something functioning like God,
Mm.
then yeah, it's idolatrous.
Part of your argument in talking about political engagement requires, one, laying a foundation of creation itself, differentiating
Yeah,
between worldly, because you're challenging the definitions that many Christians have on that, which has kept them from participating within the political realm. And you're saying, no, that's the disposition toward not talking about engagement. That's something
right,
altogether different.
right.
But then you lay the groundwork for the cultural mandate and then common grace. But let's talk about
Yes,
the cultural mandate.
yes,
Just elaborate. We've talked about that on the show, but for those that are just tuning in and this is the first time that they've ever
mhm,
listened, let's talk about the cultural mandate. Lay out what it is and what it means for each one of us.
sure. When God creates humans, and he talks about his purpose for humans in Genesis 1:26. He says that humans are going to rule over the world. They're going to have dominion. He makes them, verse 27, verse 28, he says, after it's saying, populate the world, he then says, I'm giving you the world to manage. That's why some people call it, it's not original to me to call it the first Great Commission, but that's why that I use that language. And so that first Great Commission is the managing of all of this. And that managing of all of this would include what we call political life. Because at some point, when you get more people and those people are trying to manage their life beyond their family unit, how are they deciding what that's going to be? If they decide to build roads, okay, who decides whether they're roads for everybody?
Mhm.
If you're going to have some kind of commercial enterprise between each other, who decides what the rules for those things are? Who does all that? Right? It's not just only about whether there are conflicts and how you bring justice to conflicts. It's also about how you're setting up, if you will, the rules of the game for a common life together. That would happen even if there were no falls, my but we are on the other side of the fall, so now that management of common life includes the need for justice that is, you know, involves the sword, that involves having things in place so that society doesn't go off the rails.
Mm.
So the cultural mandate I mean, it's called creation mandate or cultural mandate because when God makes the creation and he gives humans this responsibility for working in it, they are producing something. They are, to use Andy Crouch's language, they're making something of the world,
Mm.
right? So they're creating, they're cultivating, and they're producing things. And so it's a mandate given to humans. It's a blessing. It's kind of a command and blessing, one could argue. And I think here's an important thing about it. Even if somebody says yes, page 1, but I feel like page 3 vetoes that, I would then point them to Psalm 8, where Psalm 8 is not pining for the fact that we lost having this responsibility as humans to rule over God's creation. Psalm 8 is enamored and blown away by the fact that God's made it possible for humans to be the ones who have this responsibility for God's work. That's why God's, in that case, God, how excellent is your name in all the earth. Look at what you've done, including us. You thought enough of the humans made in your image that you gave them the responsibility to manage your world. Now, of course, because it's God's world. They're responsible to him for what they do in his world. But it's the fact that they even have the opportunity to do it. It's like, God, how'd you, wow, it's amazing that you did that. Not, it's amazing that that was your intent. I'm so upset that it's gone. You can't find that in Psalm 8. And so Psalm 8 at least suggests, if I'm going to put it on a soft version, at least suggests that humans still have this responsibility. What fallenness does is make it complicated, because now after fallenness, people don't always have good intent. They don't always see right. They become more selfish. They become more fearful, more suspicious of others, etc. And in the midst of those types of things, they're still making our way forward with some kind of socio-political reality together.
Why do you think so many Christians have lost sight of the cultural mandate?
Some because they never hear about it.
Hmm.
Others, I think, because it's at the beginning of the book, and honestly, here's the way I put it. I think if the way I learned about salvation is that it is a rescue from creation rather than a reclaiming and transforming of creation, then there's always this dissonance between the created order and redemption. If redemption is about getting us out of here, hey, I'm waiting for my ride to come, as some people might say, then it winds up being that salvation takes us away from all of this. When people say this world is not my home, just passing through, it's right and it's wrong. Okay. It's right in the sense that if you mean the world in terms of the world system that is created by people that are disregarding God when they do that, and the world in that sense, then yes, you're right. If you mean the created order, it's like, well, no, yeah, it is. And actually, by virtue of being a human being, you're actually part of the world yourself. So it is definitely your home. But it's not your home that you are to worship. Is where God's placed you as part of his creation. And I think one of the problems that sometimes happens is, strangely, people worship an incarnate Jesus, but it's like they become more Gnostic, right? Forgetting that the incarnate Jesus, by identifying with humans, is identifying with the crown of creation, which means he cannot be bringing a redemption that takes you away from the creation. Why do you need a resurrected Jesus, an incarnate Jesus, if it's just about knowing the right facts and then having a reconciliation with God, and then you escape into a kind of disembodied existence for eternity? I mean, that's you don't need the incarnation for that, right? And so I think that there's a way of talking about the gospel where, oh, of course, Jesus is human. It's important he identify with us so that the sin problem can be addressed. Now the sin problem is addressed, then we have this transaction that's taking place. My eternal destiny is secured in many traditions, at least, and then my life is to be a certain kind of moral person who does what they can and tries to share the good news with others, while I wait for God to come and in some cases set everything right, in other cases to blow this up and make a new one.
I want to move before we talk about common grace, as we're talking about where people have been, the viewpoint, and I think you articulating what many have experienced. I myself have felt that, where we're going to be taken out of the world. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah,
Let's get engaged.
yeah.
And honestly, we ran an episode with NT Wright, and I got a comment on Facebook where someone sent me a photo of a post that another scholar had, who had received an advanced copy of N.T. Wright's book, Jesus and the Powers.
Oh,
And he basically said, as Christians, he said, my family used to be involved, but it was when Billy Graham endorsed Nixon and it came back to bite him, and Billy Graham pulled away. Therefore, we all should pull away because we only know partially.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
That's the attitude I think many people do. We don't want to
yeah,
miss Jesus in politics. I can't tell you how
yeah,
many times I've heard that.
yeah.
But you found an author, God brought an author to you who's had a huge influence on evangelicalism and our understanding of politics, and Abraham Kuyper. and he has influenced many different people, some that many of our listeners would know, some whom they may not know. Probably the most popular, I would say, in a contemporary moment would be like a Chuck Colson. He had a huge influence on Chuck Colson, worldview, and things like that. But there's so many others.
Mm-hmm.
For those who don't know and they're listening in and they may not be familiar with Kuyper, introduce Kuyper to us and why
Sure.
his thought is so important for us today.
Sure. So Abraham Kuyper, 1837 to 1920, lived in the Netherlands. That's where he was most of his life. He did travel a little bit, but he was a pastor who became a politician. When he became a politician, he stepped away from the pastoral role. He still participated in his denomination, but he did not function as a politician while also functioning as a pastor. He helped to found a political party, and he helped found in this organization that was really a political party and other things. They also helped create the Free University of Amsterdam in 1880, and he wrote a lot. He wrote for a weekly paper and a daily paper. He was a great organizer. And in 1901, 1905, he was prime minister of the Netherlands. And I think the reason he is helpful is because he helps us to think through a way of thinking about Christian participation in society without that participation being a way of thinking that I need to take over society, or that as a Christian, the way that I function in society is to turn other things that are not church into churches. In other words, turn educational spaces, business spaces, governmental spaces, etc. Turn those things into a church. They can be engaged by Christians, transformed by Christians, but they should not be turned into churches. I think that's a way of putting it.
Mm.
And also, he gives us good theological language for why Christians should be participating in the public. And for me, it's very helpful. Now, it's important to say this because I gave this disclaimer in the book. You know why it's also good to know him? Because the more you spend time with him, the closer you get to understanding that he was great and greatly flawed. Why do I say that? This is really important. And maybe you've talked about this with other people. But I think a lot of times people get introduced to figures in ways that they're either good or bad. Read this person because they're awesome. Don't read that person because they're unhelpful, or they're wrong about a particular issue. Or if you do read them, read with a sense of being wary. The problem is when you talk about the figure who's bad, and then somebody decides to read this person and thinks there was more helpful here than I thought. Then what do you do with that? Or the flip side is you, maybe not intentionally, but you wind up making a figure like Kuyper or whoever, you wind up putting a messianic veneer on that character. And then that person, the closer you get to them, the more you see that they needed the Messiah. You see ways that they have failings. And so you're getting set up if somebody says, please read this person. And you think, please read this person means, and nothing you will encounter will be problematic for you. Right? Well, good luck reading Luther. Right? Good luck reading Kuyper. Good luck reading Karl Barth. And we just keep going. Right? And my point is then, that doesn't mean don't read them. It just means, why are you treating them like a Messiah? If they're a Christian, they're someone who's in the process of being transformed themselves. They may be tremendously gifted, tremendously helpful. Have tremendous gifting doesn't automatically make a person have complete sanctification. And so you will discover how they are not the more you spend time with them. And if we help people understand from the start, you shouldn't be expecting them to be a Messiah. Hopefully there are a lot of things that are very exemplary about them, but at the very least, you're going to find out that they didn't do something or didn't say something, and it bothers you. Or they did do something and did say something, and and then you've got to deal with it. That's called dealing with the human race. Only Jesus saves, not the figures that God has gifted that help us to think about how our faith better. And so I had to encounter that with Kuyper myself around race. it was not good. That's an understatement. So But the fact is that uh, the question that I've had to ask, and I think people need to ask about any character, any figure, is when someone has some bad thing that they do. Karl Barth having this,
Mistress, yeah.
the Charlotte von Kirschbaum relationship, or Luther and the Jews, etc. The question you have to ask is, does this language, does whatever they're saying about this, is it running through everything that they do? And particularly the things that you find helpful, is it woven into those things? I think it's an important critical thinking question for anybody to ask about any figure. And my conclusion for Kuyper is that his doctrine of common grace, which we'll talk about momentarily, his doctrine of common grace, when he describes how it works out in history, that's problematic. The definition, I would argue, does not require his description of the unfolding of history, because it doesn't entail that.
Let's pause there for a second. Can we pause there for a second? I want to go back to what you said, because I know that many of our audience have heard this name. They've heard us refer to Kuyper. They're still trying to grab a hold of him. As you said, he's a pastor. He's a newspaper guy, and he creates, in some respect, a theological system. And his vision, though, on race was played out terribly, for those that don't know, in apartheid in South Africa.
I would qualify the apartheid.
Okay, qualify it for us. You're the expert here.
There's a book called Contours of the Kuyperian Tradition by Craig Bartholomew. I recommend people read it. And Craig says that Kuyper is partially responsible for apartheid. Kuyper himself never says, please build a system over 20 years after I'm dead where you turn races into what he called spheres of society. The spheres were state, church, family, business, right? These social realities that have a kind of integrity to each one of them, and a sovereignty within the sphere, he says. And so apartheid makes racist spheres. Colors, blacks, and whites are not supposed to be together. He does, in some places, approvingly, say things about the Boers, and about the Boers forbidding intermarriage. And certainly, I mean, he says things. He says things that suggest, well, over time, even they will catch up to people. He might say, but he clearly bought into the ways that some people talked about, race, or the races. I mean, one human race, but the different ways that, Black, African people, European people, Asian people, the differences between them. And he was among those who, at least at times, had talked about an interpretation of history unfolding according to the sons of Noah, I'm sorry. Which means he obviously does not read Genesis very closely, because Canaan's the one that's cursed, not Ham. But so that way of talking about the unfolding of history, all that's true. He does all that. Particularly to South Africa, he does basically say, I think they're doing the right things, kind of keeping people separate. Nowhere does he say, one, that types of people are spheres to be kept separate. And nowhere does he say that I think you should build a system where you keep people separate like that. So certainly his idea about sphere sovereignty gets used. But the idea, if you're just reading the idea itself does not lead you to making groups of people into spheres where the boundaries are not to be, crossed. So that's why I think I'm happy to say partially responsible. I'm happy to say he was a racist. I've said it many times. He's great and greatly flawed. But the things the things that have been very helpful to me out of his greatness have given me, here's a metaphor I used in the book called Calvinism for a Secular Age, that is essays where we're reflecting on Kuyper's 1998 Stone lectures that he gave at Princeton. Did I say 1998? Yeah, 1998 was the 100-year anniversary of that. Where there was a big. There were like 3 conferences that year. But in 1898, right, he gives these 6 stone lectures at Princeton, and uh, that volume is probably what most people who've read Kuyper are going to be most familiar with in terms of reading him. Now Lexham Press has all these volumes of untranslated stuff that's available, which so I recommend people check it out. But I think the 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 opportunity with someone like Kuyper for me was reading him talk about common grace, and it was like driving in the car with the radio on, and a new song comes on that you've never heard, and it is your song. That's what it was like. That's why I say in my the revision of my dissertation that became my first book, I mean, it was a theological oxygen mask. That's what it was. There's no question about it. I was gasping, with this intuition about cultural engagement, and there it was. And there it was. The problem is like if you go buy the album, is that a person? Who's the artist? Man, I'm buying that album. You listen to the album and you like a lot of the songs. And then there's only 2 songs left. They're about to bring it home. And the next to the last song, you're thinking, what is this song doing on this album? I hate that song. Are you kidding? No, please tell me that somebody played a joke and put that song on the album. Who's the practical joker in the record, that put this on there? No, well, his name was Kuyper, is the practical joker. It's just part of his failings. And the thing is, sometimes people go, I don't see how you could do this. Like, look, why teach political theology? I'm still assigning John Howard Yoder. Okay, and I don't know how much you've talked about Yoder on Apollo's Water, but
we've never mentioned it before. But I mean, I know who he is. Of course, anybody that's been in
John Howard, very important for this book called The Politics of Jesus. Very important for there being a neo-Anabaptist thing. Some people might say, no, Stanley Hauerwas is like instrumental to that. Well, you're not going to get Stanley without John Howard Yoder, because Yoder's very influential for him. Because Stanley doesn't grow up as an Anabaptist. Stanley's a Methodist, right? So, or he grew up Methodist. I mean, so Yoder's influence, I think, is very important for him being this person that helps people to think about, this kind of being an alternative witness approach to things. So you have to assign Yoder. Here's the thing. Yoder had inappropriate encounters with over 100 women. Now, and I mean, and some of them were, holding on to someone, laying his head on someone's lap. I mean, some of them apparently did involve disrobing us. So I don't know how many were actually like intercourse or whatever. But the point is that that's a lot. And a great irony when part of your whole thing is also like nonviolent resistance. But you don't see in anything that Yoder writes that's giving you that would ever be excuse making for his behavior. Now, apparently he had some idea. Stanley Hauerwas says, he goes, John, brilliant man that he was, had a very stupid idea. That basically, Jesus says, none are given in marriage in the eschaton. And that if we're in a way kind of inhabiting the eschaton now, that we can relate to each other that way. I mean, that's kind of
that's jacked up.
Sort of the idea. And so, that's crazy. But reading Yoder will not turn you into a sexual predator. So it
doesn't. But that's kind of the whole point of the scriptures, where we see these people that are deeply flawed. I mean, Solomon, for crying out loud, the wisest man to ever live, and have all the wives and concubines, and even funding projects for alternative religions.
Right. Yeah, right.
If you think about it, I mean, David is an adulterer.
Gotta create the spaces for the foreign wives to worship.
Oh my gosh. That's what I this is where I think that people that are more from the fundamentalist bent, they want to see it in black and white, and God always operates right on the edge. He takes you up to even with Mary, being a teenage girl, that betrothed, right in that part where it
Yeah,
makes people
yeah,
go,
yeah,
it doesn't fit the categories. He takes it
yeah,
right up to that edge.
yeah, yeah.
And I think what you're bringing out, even with Kuyper, is we're talking about these issues, especially in the political issues. There's not always a black and white. This is
Uh,
how we have to understand
well,
this.
and even the ones you think are black and white, it's like you think the public policy that would ever make it out is going to be like that. A,
Exactly.
a pristine public policy that somehow drops straight from the mouth of God. Good luck when you got to work with other human beings. Even just
Yeah.
working with other Christians is not going to turn out that way. So, one of the things I think about in terms of the political piece, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about this later, but when we think about politics, politics is a very experimental activity.
What do you mean by that?
In other words, you're throwing things at a wall and seeing if it sticks.
I'm laughing because I think most people would be like, seriously? Yeah, most politics, that's what it is. They're just seeing
Exactly what it
what
is.
doesn't work.
We call it the American experiment that we're in the first, as it
Yeah,
is. So,
it is an experiment. Yeah.
and the reason I've taken to using the experimental language in the last couple of years is, if you think of it in terms of an experiment, it takes the pressure off to somehow I have to come up with this perfect Christian public policy.
In church, that's how we would get around things. I mean, it sounds bad, but we would say, instead of saying we're going in this direction, we're like, we're going to try this for a little bit. And that helped people because they have this, we have this way that psychologically, if it's set for that, we feel like there's no return. But let's go back to Kuyper for a moment. His doctrine of common grace is very important. And I know some people are out there going, you lost me already. No, we're going to bring you in because we really want you to understand why we are engaging and asking for people to engage the way that we are. And common grace helps that up. So for those that are, again, theologically not at the doctoral level, let's lay that out for them. You're used to working with undergraduates, but let's say that we're having people that are saying, hey, I've been in the church my whole life. I've never
Yeah.
heard of common
Right.
grace.
Right.
What
Yeah.
is
Well, I
common
hadn't heard of
grace?
it till I read it in
That's
so
true.
like so so let me just to bring people up to this. So think about this. Abraham Kuyper, a Dutch theologian who also wound up being prime minister one day, who also was a professor. So he was a very versatile figure and great organizer who wrote a lot. A lot of that writing also included his efforts to encourage Christians to be engaged in God's work. Key to that was the doctrine of common grace. What you think about common grace is answering this question: why does the world go on after Genesis 3? Or how do we think about the promise God makes to Noah after the flood? God says to Noah, I'm not going to do this again. I'm going to do what? I'm going to preserve the world. You can argue that there's a recommissioning that
Mm.
happens in terms of, going back to that first Great Commission, a recommissioning that happens when God says to Noah, okay, we're starting over. Time to start building, it's time to start creating society. And so what happens then is common grace is a way of talking about God doing something he did not have to do, but he does, which is he preserves the world. And not only does he preserve the world, God, gives gifts to Christians and non-Christians. I like to distinguish between spiritual gifts, like we're talking about in 1 Corinthians 12, let's say, gifts that God gives that are oriented towards the mission of the church and outreach, let's say, versus talents, which are gifts that God gives to human beings in general. And people may have tremendous abilities, God-given talent, as people will say, that those things come from God. So common grace explains why you can have a Miles Davis who's clearly a musical genius, but he was a difficult person to understate the case. Now, I'm still going to go to the mat and say Kind of Blues the greatest jazz album ever, but Miles was difficult. So did Miles get that ability because he went in the woods somewhere, made a pentagram, set it on fire, made a deal with the devil? Is that where he got the talent from? No, he got the talent because God gave it to him. So it means that God makes possible good things, and maybe not ultimately good, but penultimately good things happening in the world. And a baseline way of thinking about it is to say is that because even though the fall happens, God makes it possible for humans to still participate in the cultural mandate. So God preserves the world. And there's this language about restraining the effects of sin. Sin does not operate unbridled in the world, is the way
Mm.
that Kuyper might put it. And this preservation and this you know beating back sin, sin leading things to absolute chaos. That action of God, that preserving action of God, and that generosity of God to the whole of creation, to all people, makes it possible to continue to do this work of trying to bring about some kinds of flourishing through the world. And political life is part of that.
Political life then helps the flourishing of society. That's what you're saying?
Yes. Yes.
I know some people are like,
Or
huh,
organizing our life in society, whatever language you want to use. Yeah.
because we are to seek the flourishing of society, are we not?
Yes. I think we are. Yes.
Why do
I,
so many
I'll make it. I'll make it easy for everybody. Yeah. You know how we're supposed to make the flourishing of society? What is the second greatest commandment? The second greatest commandment, Jesus says, all the law and prophets hang on these two great commandments. Vertical, love God above all else. Translation, have no other gods before me. God alone is God.
Mhm.
Have your allegiance correct. And then everything else that's horizontal is love your neighbor as yourself. And when Paul talks about love your neighbor as yourself, he says, love does no harm to a neighbor. Now, when you think about all the ways that can happen, that's not just interpersonal. That can also be in the kind of society that you build. Because why are you doing anything? Why are you doing what you're doing? You're building society. You're not just thinking about, okay, let's just build a road. You think about where's that road going to go? What kind of road is it going to be? How safe is it going to be? Right? When we're doing the public policies are being made, are the policies only thinking about just protecting people, or are they thinking about trying to create opportunities for people to have, let's say in the United States, to have lives where they can have liberty, in other words, they can have freedom to go about a life of really the kind of agency, personal agency that most people haven't had in world history, to create
if
the conditions for that for everyone.
that's the hard part though, is what do you do when those things that we want to see the flourishing of society and we want to see people to be able to perform it, but of course
Yeah.
what happens when what they desire, we would say as Christians, would be against the flourishing of society if they were in pursuit of it, even though their heart desires it.
Well, I think that that's part of how we are guided by what God reveals to us. And we try at least to um, have a frame of what a good life looks like, or a good life for society looks like. A good life for society includes a society where it's not like the movie The Purge. Okay, 24 hours, you can kill whoever you want
Yeah.
without penalty. No, no, there's no purge in this society, right? No, we have laws so that if you're one of those people, you suffer the consequences. So there are
Tom
things that you put into place to bring about, at least the uh, circumstance for people to exercise their personal agency.
Tom
Um,
Wright, Tom, when he was on the show, Tom Wright, he made the comment, he said, even tyranny is better than anarchy.
yeah, yeah,
And that was the idea is even there's something that restrains people that are
yes,
there. And so
exactly.
when we do vote, but this is where though I find the categories become different.
Yeah.
Kevin Van Hooser was on the show. We
Hmm.
had a conversation about majority world theology.
Yeah.
And he's like, It's very hard to do because the categories are so different. And this is what I find in
Yeah.
interacting with people from so many different ethnic backgrounds.
Yeah.
Every group, though they are Christian that I end up working with, no matter what their
Yeah.
ethnic background is, has a
Yeah.
very different theological category or a hierarchy in their theological
Mhm.
categories as to what is there, what is real, what is preeminent. And it's hard
Yeah.
because
Right.
some are, let's say for the life issues, though, they would say, let's say we're talking about abortion,
Yeah.
they'd say, well,
Yeah.
life is a first issue.
Yeah. Right.
But
Right.
those people, usually the ones that are advocating for that specific position, are in a frame where their existence isn't being threatened for their skin color. So you have that idea, but then you have, like you said before, as you've already articulated, that was our survival, is what we're voting for. But you see this collision of it because this is the tension. Even when I see Democrats and Republicans, my church was both, historically both. And I would say, there's positions biblically that the Bible affirms in each one of them, and there's something that the Bible challenges in each one of them. So how do we delineate between what becomes the priority and what becomes secondary?
So here's a great place to start. Remember what you believe about sin. If you believe that sin means that people have a clouded perspective, and that even Christians have at least a partially clouded perspective, then nobody should expect it to be quite so clear about whatever you're going to do in terms of public policy. And so we have to be honest about the fact that we just don't see all that clearly. We may know certain truths and we may know certain things that we ought to do, but then when we think about how you're going to build a good society, then I think we get into the complications about um, the assumptions that, oh, if this person's just made alive by God and then we put them in place to be an office holder, they're going to do a good job just because they seem to be a quality Christian person. It's like, yeah, but they don't know anything about politics. Why are you expecting them to just miraculously know what to do? And why are you expecting them to know what good public policy is? They may have good intentions, but do they know exactly how you build a policy, how you implement a policy? If you don't know any of that, then you may have all the greatest intentions in the world, but you may be a wreck in terms of what you actually do in terms of political life. So there has to be a formation about how to learn to do how to learn to do politics, and I mean in the best sense of the word, how to do it, in one's culture. And of course, depending upon where you are in the world, that will be complicated. How much you're able to do will vary. The Christian in North Korea can't do anything near what the Christian in the United States can do, and the Christian in other democracies, depending upon what kind of world it is, that you may have less possibilities. You may feel more like an exile, even though you may have a vote. You still may feel experientially like you're in exile because of what is happening in the culture. And then in some other places, you have the opportunity where you're really being invited as a citizen to contribute what you think to saying, hey, here's why we need more playgrounds. Here's why we need more sidewalks. Here's why we need to change the cycle of paving and repaving streets, whatever it is. So it's going to vary because of context, and it's going to be complicated because we're not realized in our vision. We don't have an eschatological vision. In other words, what I mean is, we may have let's say you've written a book on eschatology and you feel like you've got a good articulation of what's going on. Great. Knowing that doesn't mean that your actual person has been completely sanctified and now you're inhabiting this realized humanity that comes with the eschaton, and therefore you see, perceive, and act in that way. And the thing is that we all know that. And so we need to temper our expectations. And one of the ways we temper our expectations is by understanding that the point of politics is not for politics to be everything. The point of politics is for it to be one of the ways that we're trying to think about what kind of community we're going to build, and how is this community are we going to try to create possibilities for flourishing for people, and in what ways do you think about what policies you need to pursue for that, and how you do that in a world where everybody does not see things the same way you do, where on the one hand even the Christians don't all see things the same way, and then on top of that there are people who aren't Christian who have different ways of thinking about things, where there may be overlap but where there's difference, and you have to navigate that complex pluralistic reality. The fact of navigating that, the fact of that complication, doesn't mean you have nothing to do. The options aren't easy victory or just check out. No, it's kind of like life itself. It's complicated, and we keep navigating things, and sometimes we have these great moments of flourishing and everything's awesome. There are other times you might feel like you're on this carousel that just keeps going round and round and round, doesn't go anywhere. At times you might feel like things are going backward. At times you might feel like you're stuck. Welcome to the world between Genesis 3 and Revelation 21. Don't be surprised. But don't be surprised doesn't mean be cynical. It means just have a perspective about thinking about, well, what is the possibility here? Earlier, I suggested that if politics is a way of thinking about loving your neighbor at a larger scale, but whatever those expressions are penultimate, then I'm thinking about how can I make it a little bit better?
What
And
role?
maybe occasionally some policy may give you the opportunity to make it a lot better. But it's always going to be in a context where whatever is done, even if it's the greatest public policy, it's the greatest public policy in a world of broken people, in a world of people with messed up perspectives or different perspectives. And so it's just not going to just make everything nice and easy.
What role then does the term that you employed was cruciform transformation?
Yeah, yeah. Well, the point about that is understanding that however we are going forward, we're going forward in a world where you might really feel more of the resistance, more of the inertia. You might feel pain. You might feel hostility.
Mm.
And the thing is no Christian reading the Bible should be surprised about getting hostility from a world that is not completely God's kingdom. You know, Jesus has come; he's been resurrected, so the kingdom that it's established, but it's not consummated. So now and not yet. So because we're in that reality, then sometimes people are going to find themselves living in situations like in First Peter, where what it suggests is that it's likely that no matter what some of you do, people are still going to mistreat you. And it has nothing to do with whether you were honoring the king or whether you were an upright person. It's because people are just finding reasons to think that you're the problem. And then they will act like it. Or they will use their power when you have less power. And you will experience that. So sometimes people will experience that. And in those moments, that's what I mean by cruciform transformation, is that while you're trying to live with faithfulness, you're experiencing
Suffering.
Suffering and things that may feel like loss, may be loss.
But you keep going.
Exactly.
You keep going.
Exactly.
Not willing to go necessarily to the lowest common denominator.
No, because I think you take everything on a case by case basis. What are the ways that we are trying to seek a society that is seeking the flourishing not just of people like myself, but of all people, and even people who might not think that what I think is flourishing is flourishing.
I know your time is limited today, and how do we leave our folks with a water bottle? What's one good thought, and even maybe a summary of what we've talked about today on what it means to be a political disciple or Christians trying to figure out how to live out their theology publicly in the political realm?
Sure. A disciple is a person whose life belongs to God, right? Who is following Jesus. and their life is to be shaped to look more and more like him. So it is as much about the persons that we are becoming as much as it is about the difference that we're trying to make in the world. When we think about whatever kind of difference we're trying to make in the world, God's generosity into the world through this common grace has made it possible for us to continue to lead to at least some little positive developments happening in the world. And when we do that, what are we really trying to do? We're finding ways to seek the good of not just our people, but of all people that are image bearers, because there's no asterisk besides neighbor in the Bible. Every human being is your neighbor. And so the Christian thinks about, how do I, under God, with God at work within me, with God giving me the possibility of participating in his world, how am I living a life of faithfulness that isn't just about introducing people to Jesus, but also modeling the fact that I'm like Jesus by thinking about how I'm seeking the good of others and not just myself.
Mm.
Not because I think I'm ever going to make the kingdom of God happen. That's only going to happen when Jesus returns. But while we're waiting for him to return, we do have the opportunity to gesture towards what it might be like when he does and when he sets everything right. And maybe there are little ways we can think about doing it.
Mm.
It doesn't have to be a grand thing, but what little things can we think about doing in terms of our disposition, in terms of the things that we want to support as we seek to make the world a little bit better?
Mm. Well, Vincent, thank you for coming on the show. And
Oh, it's great.
how can people learn more about what you're doing?
They can go to my website, www.vincentbacote.com. Sometime this year, I'm going to revise the website, but that will stay the same. And there, people can find out about my writing, my speaking. People can invite me to speak or invite me to do. It says coaching or coaching consulting, whatever language they prefer. They can invite me to do that. Um, and I'm happy to be a resource for people and to help serve others.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on Apollos Watered.
It's a great privilege.